Welcome to The Global Signal, a podcast exploring how technologies, international policy, and financial markets are reshaping global power. I'm your co-host, Joshua Charles.
And I'm Benjamin Fields. Each episode, we move beyond the headlines to examine the strategic forces that will matter not just this year, but decades from now. How nations compete, when cooperation is still possible, and what long-term thinking looks like in a world defined by rapid change.
In today's episode, we'll explore three big questions: how the United States should think about its relationship with China, why Africa's emerging middle class is becoming strategically central to the global economy, and what it would take for America to articulate a credible long-term national strategy.
It's my pleasure to welcome Joseph Schneider. He's a national security entrepreneur and strategist with more than 4 decades of leadership across aerospace, defense, and the security sectors. He's founded 3 international consulting and research firms, served on the board of multiple public and private defense companies, advised senior leaders in the U.S. Department of Defense and allied governments worldwide. Here at Frontier Dominion, we really love our country and respect our service members who make everything possible. So we'd like to recognize him for being a U.S. Army Green Beret officer with 17 years of service. He's also a graduate of West Point, Harvard Business School, and the Harvard Kennedy School. He immigrated to the United States from communist Romania as a child and continues to be a frequent speaker on defense industry, strategy, and policy. Thank you for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you, and we are looking forward to the insights that you'll be able to share with us and our audience.
Thank you. Good, great to be here.
Okay, fantastic. So, Jeff, as you and I have previously talked about from time to time, and as has been incredibly clear and important, I think, when it comes to U.S. foreign policy, is just thinking about America-China relations. I think clearly there are opportunities for us to think strategically about how we can better position our initiatives and programs to essentially collaborate more with China. And so we're curious to know, why do you think the U.S. would be better off pursuing collaborative, forward-thinking partnerships with China rather than framing the relationship as a new Cold War, which has been a large sentiment in Washington, D.C.?
On the one hand, the greatest strategic relationship over the last 40 years or so, 30 to 40 years, has been the U.S.-China relationship. China, when Nixon opened the door to China, had killed, something close to 60 million of their own people, and the consolidation of power by Mao and his clique. And most of the people in China lived in dire poverty, died of famine, could not feed themselves. And because of Mao's successors and their adoption of more liberal economic policies and the opportunity to partner with the U.S. and through the U.S. to the global markets, and because of low-cost labor that they brought to the party, plus access to a fairly large market that was growing and demographically very favorable conditions because they had a young population that was growing. So all those factors combined to make China relatively prosperous to what they were. And because of the cost advantage and the capital that was invested by the U.S. and the joint economic benefit, China grew significantly to the point that they have become more of a modern society. Today, 2 things have happened. One is China's upward trajectory is being deeply challenged. For example, during their growth period, China had 7 workers for every person that was of retirement age to support them. And the 7 people, that it was significant population growth that, again, it created a much larger market. So economically, they were in very favorable terms. And because of the loosening, well, to some extent, the loosening of controls, but probably even more significant is that most bureaucrats in the Communist Party had been decimated during the Mao's Great Leap Forward, or whatever latest purge he had, that there were very few people to keep entrepreneurs under wraps. So the Chinese economy grew significantly and created a relatively viable middle class relative to their society. However, again, 2 things happen. One is that the West and America lives by the motto that the way we fund things and the way we make the national security decisions is to mitigate perceived threats. It's much easier to use threat as a reason why you want to fund this program or that program, as opposed to judge it on its own merits and what you're trying to achieve, which is a theme of my approach. But so as a result, China, because as they became more prosperous, they invested more and more in defense capabilities. So it's easy to say, look how much the Chinese are investing in this area and that area. So because of that, China became a much easier target to be used as an example of why we needed to invest in this program and that. Look how many ships the Chinese are building. Look, they're building more nuclear weapons. Well, they're still like number 5. No, they're number 3, but still relatively small. And the second is the Chinese have developed their own demographic problem. For example, because of the one-child policy that they use in order, during this period where they had all these young people, they adopted a one-child policy. Right now, China, for every person of retirement age, they have only like 1 person working or something, or probably even worse than that. They have more retired people than have people supporting them. So demographically, they're in a very bad situation, which has significant challenges for them, because even though they've had significant growth and investment in different technologies, and they stole a lot of technologies, which people do. So people stealing technologies is not something original with the Chinese, but between their own demographic problems and the benefit that U.S. has from portraying China as an adversary and be able to use the Chinese growth statistics or their advancement in this technology or that technology as vehicles to kind of validate our own investment exercises. I will not call it strategy because that's giving it too much credit, but our own investment imperatives that we use China as the whipping boy, that they're this and that, when in fact, for example, China spends 7 times as much money on internal security than they do on external security, despite all the claims that we are making, which are all based in some facts. Maybe they're selective and portrayed in a certain way, but it's not facts. They're just not really relevant or critical or important. For example, the Chinese are expanding. They're doing all these things in investments. They control the Panama Canal. So what? What can they do? All we have to do is send 1 warship there, and we control it. It's not like they'll be able to stop American shipping. Maybe they could do it for like 20 seconds, but no one's going to pay any attention to who owns the docks in Panama if push comes to shove. So I think China has been a target of opportunity, that fits well within the U.S. Decision-making process and justification process. The question, I think, far more important is, what do we do going forward? What is the shape of the world order going forward? We had a world order that was more or less created in 1945. We built institutions to enforce it, whether it was the UN or NATO, etc., that were able to maintain relative peace and stability. Most of the conflicts that occurred were either civil wars of one kind or another, decolonization wars, of things of that nature, but most of those were, again, civil wars of transfer of power between one tribe and another. We don't have a structure today. And if you look at the current national security strategy, which has a number of interesting points, the key conclusion that you can draw from that is the way we are looking to the future is a world. It's for the U.S. to be disengaged from the world. That U.S. engagement in the world is not necessarily positive for us. And second, that the world that we're entering an era of balance of power, which means that we are prepared we have already accepted conceptually that the U.S. hegemonistic power that we had in 1991 at the fall of the Soviet Union is no longer overwhelming. And we will face more relatively peer competitors that we will have to somehow deal with whenever we have to deal with them, as opposed to be able to impose, a certain peace or system on the world. And within that, China, because of their past activities and current activities, which I would argue are mainly designed to improve their economic position and condition, that China is now a peer adversary, and that our key objective relative to China is to deter China from getting too strong or making too much money, or whatever China does, we have to deter them, when in fact, for the last 30, 40 years, both China and the US and West have had a very positive symbiotic relationship with China that benefited everybody. And the question is, do we benefit more by deterring China, or do we benefit more by trying to find ways that we can create win-win situations? And obviously, if China's power and abilities relative to ours increase, we have to adjust our relationship with them. But I would argue that there's far more to gain by the U.S. Collaborating with potential adversaries, whether it's China, whether it's Japan, if Japan changes strategy, which they're about to do, or others. Or do we live because we have all these adversaries, China, Iran, Russia, North Korea? God forbid that North Korea ever gets on a boat and does something, because they have so much to gain by nuking California. To that extent, I think rethinking how we deal with China, and I would argue, dealing with China is very important, because in a world where balance of power is the conceptual framework, almost all balance of power I'm trying to think of historical examples where a balance of power arrangement did not end up in a war as a way to, because war is the ultimate arbiter of settling disputes. And in balance of power, things generally degenerate to the point of view that someone thinks, either from a defensive position or an offensive position, that they have to make a statement and use military power and kinetic activity to finalize a temporary advantage. So my point of view is that the U.S., a far better strategic framework for the U.S. is to figure out ways to manage all these other rising power, which is great that different societies, whether it's Vietnam or Indonesia or other societies are improving. That's great. The stronger they get, the bigger say they have at the table. But at the end of the day, we should formulate and frame a world that is based on a win-win situation where the world becomes more prosperous, prosperity becomes more distributive, so you have greater stability in the world, and I will argue later that is within our power and capability, but it's not within our current mindset.
The question you just answered has this kind of Cold War labeling structure. I think the interesting thing is if we take the Cold War and then we take what's going on with China now, they're both, communist purporting countries. They both liberalized their economies. They both have a lot of similarities, but what are the differences between Russia, China, and then why is it that our relationship with Russia kind of converged to this point? And do we see the same thing happening with China, or do we see different characteristics about China that will likely lead to a different relationship compared to what we have with Russia today?
I think the fundamental aspect of humanity is that we are organized by blood. You have a tribe, the tribe takes over the next tribe or enslaves them or make them pay tribute. So all of human history is tribally based. And when you look at societies and civilizations, they are all, except for three that I'll mention later, all civilizations are for the benefit of one race. You have a Chinese civilization, you have a French civilization, we have an English civilization, you have a Russian civilization. And they're all designed to improve the condition of that tribe, and generally at the expense of neighboring tribes that become vassal states or allies, different sort of relationships, but it's all tribally based. There's only been 3 societies that have really created and left a legacy and improved the lives of their citizens and made things better and innovated. And those 3 societies have one thing in common, and that is they are based on the concept of individual freedom, whether it's the Greeks, the Romans, or the founding fathers in America. That the highest value of humanity, endowed to us by our Creator, validated for the first time by Moses, who said, I would rather starve in the desert than not be able to worship my God on bended knee in the richest agricultural area of the time when the greatest cause of survival and death was famine. That's why the Jews ended up in Egypt, because of famine. And Egypt and the Nile Valley was the most bountiful area in the ancient world. And yet they left it for freedom. And every place you see people struggling for freedom, Exodus is their shining light and the sign. The founding fathers appreciated that, and they were able to conceive of a governing system where individual freedom, all men are created equal. In today's parlance, all people are created equal, but the way they articulated it meant the same thing. So those are the fund. And when you have societies based on individual freedom, you have a chance for individuals to achieve their true potential that was given to them by God through effort and through capability. So that I think is the difference between Russian society, Chinese society. So the question comes down, what kind of world will we live in the future? Is it a world based on any of these individual Chinese dominate? What kind of government system or governance system that will the Chinese bring? Is the Chinese governance system based on individual freedom? Hardly. It's still very much a tribal system. Same thing with the Russian. All these systems are based on one form or another of authoritarianism or tyranny. Only the American system is based, that's alive today, is based on individual freedom. And we were able to translate that to the world a little bit with the aid of the French Revolution, which was based and inspired by the American Revolution and formalized by an Italian called Napoleon, that brought the ideals of the American Revolution of individual freedom to the rest of Europe. But in each European country, when eventually was adopted, it was still very much in a tribal way. And when the Germans beat the French, they didn't instill democracy or anything like that, or vice versa. It was all for the benefit of that specific tribe to, get some sort of an advantage for their people. So, the way of the future, in my view, is if we can formalize and institutionalize the American value system as opposed to any of the alternative value systems. So if America doesn't triumph, we are going to enter a very dark world. And especially given, we may enter a dark world irrespective of that because of things like AI and robotics and changing demographics. We face a very uncertain future of its own making. But certainly from a political structural point of view, only freedom is our solution to be able to hopefully still maintain humanity in the light that God has created humanity.
Thank you. I really appreciate that answer. It gives a much better sense of how you think about the world and how you see things, and then how these are translating into your answers given your experience. And so given all of this, what would a win-win strategy look like for the US and China moving forward in practice? And where do you see the greatest areas of cooperation, and where do you see some frictions likely to happen?
The biggest challenge we have with China is the fact that they're going to collapse, more than likely, given all the trends that I mentioned before. So we're going to have to help them in moderating that decline, because a lot of countries and societies are deeply tied to China's prosperity, because China is primarily driven by economic imperatives. They're trying to make as much money as they can, and all the investments they make, all the political moves they make, everything is designed primarily with an economic favorable outcome. So on the other hand, if China collapses and collapses magnificently, it will have severe repercussions for the rest of the world economy. So managing China's decline, it's in our best interest. So I would say that's the first. Second, China has lots of investments. They're willing to invest. They invest strategically, etc. We can try to do joint ventures with them, economic benefits that they will benefit, we will benefit, places where we can provide, some stability, etc. So try to to look at the situation. What can we do together that will benefit both of us, as opposed to what are you doing? How can we stop you from doing what you're doing? Because if you do anything good, it's going to be bad for us. So just changing the basic assumption, just like in any family. I equate the world to the way a law firm operates. In a law firm, every partner wants to have the corner office. So they're going to work real hard, get clients, make money. On the other hand, there's going to be no bonuses if the firm doesn't make money. So you want to make sure that the firms make money. And on the other hand, the guy that's kind of managing all this, who's the current managing director, has his name on the door. That's America. Okay. So you need to do the better than the guy next to you, but you hope that together we're making money, because that's the only way I'm going to end up having a nice bonus and a house in the Hamptons. So that's the way, smart people run their activities. This human experience is human experience. And you got to look at what sort of enterprises succeed and create value and create wealth, and what sort of activities create conflict and create destruction. So base your activities on examples of creating wealth. The problem in the policy world is that most people are historians, and they can tell you 100 ways and one why you're in this current situation, why this is happening, why that is happening, but very few of them have any experience saying, what is the solution? How do we move the ball forward? How do we succeed? So that's the challenge that we have, and the opportunity that we have, because given the technology and given the state of the world and given our overwhelming power that we still have, America still spends 35% of the global defense spending. That's America. Okay. And that's not counting all the other things that are kind of hidden in different DOE budget and intelligence budgets, all sorts of other things that we do. So America still is the overwhelming power, the dominating power in the world. It's a question, how do we use that power, if we use it at all? And do we have a vision of a better world that we can help bring forward and potentially alleviate the demographic and technology problems that our society is going to face?
The fact of the matter is, we need to be more future oriented, and we need to be cognizant of demographic trends, as well as trends regarding capital markets and synergy with respect to natural resources, defense tech, and optimizing our supply chains while ensuring that there are mutually beneficial outcomes involved. One clear avenue for partnerships lies in the African continent. There is a lot of positive demographic trends concerning population growth, concerning the youth population, and I would argue that Africa holds tremendous leverage in sustaining America's future power. From your vantage point, Joe, what dynamics within Africa's emerging middle class make this moment so strategically important for the United States?
I would say Africa is civilization's greatest challenge. I will not call it opportunity or threat, but certainly greatest challenge that we face over certainly the next 50 years. And I'll just give you a couple of statistics. One, 50 years ago, Africa had the population 1/3 that of Europe. Today, Africa has a population that's 3 times the size of Europe. 15% of France is already African. In 2100, Africa will have 10 times the population of Europe. Today, 75% of poverty, extreme poverty that I mentioned before, less than $3 a day, 75% of that is in sub-Saharan Africa. You add North Africa and a little bit of the Middle East, and you're talking over 90% of extreme poverty. There is not one country in Africa that is smarter. There are different sections here and there where you have a little more economic activity, etc. On top of that, Africa is divided politically for the benefit of French and English colonialists, not because economically makes sense, tribally makes any sense, or anything like that. So the basic political infrastructure of Africa is askewed. There's no rationality for the way Africa is organized, especially now that the French and the British have lost a lot of their hegemony or their power in Africa. Not completely, but for the most part. So the question is, what kind of world would it be if, and this, like I said, no country in Africa can absorb this huge growth in population that is expected and anticipated. So if you look at the world again, the way smart people do things, they say, well, what has something worked and how can we duplicate it? So when you look at what has worked that brought a society from feudalism to modernity, the best example is South Korea. And South Korea, to one form or another, because American had troops there and provided a lot of security, and South Koreans developed economically at some point, and then we tolerated a military dictatorship there for 30 years. At some point, the middle class in South Korea said, perhaps given the fact that, there's a middle class here and far more important, far better way to kind of decide how we allocate society's resources should be through democratic institutions rather to how Colonel Kim decides to do this or that when he wakes up in the morning. And, South Korea today is a very viable, progressive economic powerhouse of its own, etc. So the question is, can we adopt the model of South Korea of how they created a middle class in Africa so that Africa can absorb as much as possible population growth and then also enjoy economic prosperity, social and economic mobility like free societies do. And in order to do that, at a minimum, you need what South Korea had, which is a middle class. So the question then becomes, how do you get a middle class in Africa, specifically in Africa, but throughout the world, but specifically in Africa? Because if you don't get it there, the rest of the world is going to face, imagine the significant demographic issues you're going to have if the statistics like I quoted earlier are not addressed. So the answer is simple but difficult, because in every society, only the local elites know how to handle and control and incentivize the people that they are on top of. So you have to create incentives for local tribal leaders to enable the creation of a middle class. And the example of South Korea, if you create the right incentives and the right structures, and most importantly, the right rewards for tribal leaders and for those entities, there is a possibility to create a middle class if you focus on that, and that's your objective, and that's what you reward, to create a middle class in Africa. And then that middle class can then perpetuate itself, because then you would have associated with it greater power, greater economic institutions, etc. And if we don't solve that problem, everything else that's going on in the world is going to be comparatively insignificant, given the mobility that people have today and the destruction of traditional values that has binded societies forever, the entitlement. So there are lots of social and problems associated with it that would probably bring along a very different world of tyranny and authoritarianism and poverty. So the solution for mankind is freedom, in my view, and associated with that is solving the problems of Africa. And if we can solve the problem of Africa, the same model can apply to all other societies, and we can actually create a world of stability, security, and prosperity.
When we consider some of the opportunities for institutional strengthening, I think there's so much applicable to the rule of law, to the property rights, to the maturation of secure transactions law and collateral registry systems, and just the entire gamut of economic development, nation state development, not just the emergence of political institutions, but also the financial and economic counterparts. And so I think when we look at, African nation states, what's clear to me is that there is this opportunity for even the United States to support some of the institutional capacity building in geographies and countries where the land demarcation of such countries is quite tremendous. Let's look at Algeria, or let's look at the Democratic Republic of Congo as two prime examples. The Democratic Republic of Congo, a sizable amount of land, and so I think a lot of people are wondering, okay, how can these different heads of states in these countries effectively manage great terrain where there might be less historical ties when it comes to the actual government of these countries being involved. Do you have any comments on that, Joe?
I recently had a similar discussion with a former very senior USAID official. And initially, his initial, oh, this will never happen. You have this problem, you have that problem. Towards the end, he said, no, those are some good ideas, but you still have this problem. I said, well, I never thought of it. I'm glad that you have. But, I truly believe that someone like you that knows the system can identify it. If you know what your objectives are, that you can figure a way around that problem and a solution for it. You say, yeah, I think we can do this, or we can do that, and we can find a solution. I would say, to your point, there are, in the implementation stage, there are a lot of impediments, and the bureaucracy I had a discussion earlier today about a geographic region, and some people were advocating for different policies. And the person sitting next to me, former senior State Department official, says, the problem with your ideas, it involves 3 different locations in the State Department, how we are organized in looking at different regions. Your team, your group falls onto 3 different things. So they will never talk to each other because the State Department is not organized to deal with your problem. And so I don't know what the solution set is for that one. But all I'm saying is that for every situation, the devil is always in the details. But it's my experience that humans are very creative, and they can find solutions to problems as long as they have a very clear idea of what they're trying to achieve, what they're measured on, and what they're rewarded on. So if you create the right incentive system, the right measurement system, the right objectives that people believe in and are attainable, smart people are going to figure a way to accomplish that. So you just have to focus on the reward system and the measurement system. And I have full faith that smart people like the people we have in this conversation will find 50 different ways to be able to create value.
I want to bridge Joshua's follow-up question with the original question and then give it a little bit of context. And so, currently, as we had talked right before, my PhD research is on how real estate entrepreneurs succeed in Cameroon.
Mhm.
And in African countries, there's this environment that exists. I think people mistake the fact they think that capitalism happens without, bureaucracy or management, but you need the protection of things like property rights. And so there are people in Africa who are yearning for these types of opportunities and finding ways in which they can get around informality, the state not operating properly, etc. So if we connect what you said earlier about making sure there's an African middle class, how can we take advantage of that as the US moving forward? Because I think one of the beautiful things about China becoming prosperous is that they created a middle class that buys our products and services, which ultimately is better for our economy. And if there's going to be, 1 to 2 billion Africans by the year 2100, what would it look like if they had a prosperous middle class? How would that benefit us economically? And then which lever should we use to kind of assure that? But then also, where do you see the most likely sectors, for example, that we could take advantage of in terms of this African middle class?
Well, I think the middle class, for the most part, in order to have a real middle class, rather than bureaucrats that have the inside track and able to get more resources out of the system and become more prosperous relative to their cohorts, is small business. Is people having a stake in that. That's the secret of America. We have a lot of small farms and individual workers, etc. That could have, whether it was a push cart or eventually, they had a stake in the system, and the system rewarded them for what they're doing. So in my view, the way you bring in, and that's kind of what we did in Western Europe by providing stability and providing security, so to enable the creation of a middle class. And so if we're able to provide stability and security, a middle class will develop on its own, with the right incentives and the right structures, and that in turn will create opportunities for greater international business collaboration and trade and economic activity. But the key is a middle class, and in my view, the way to create it is figure ways to incentivize all the people that you have to incentivize. So if you have to incentivize someone disproportionately to allow a middle class to evolve, or to be incentivized to help create a middle class, that's what we should do, and look at the long term rather than the short. There are a lot of people, if you read revisionist history, you can see that there were a lot of people that were incentivized to support the Revolutionary War against the British because they wanted land in Kentucky and other places that the British were not allowing them to have, and they want to expand their tobacco farms west or whatever. But the average American still saw some economic benefit to themselves of not being abused and not being taxed without representation. So it was a combination of the two: A, having the elites see some economic benefit that they would gain, but B, the general population incentivized and I would say inspired by people like Thomas Paine and others, that Ben Franklin. If you look back, you can see how really smart these people were and how foresighted. Alexander Hamilton, Madison, John Jay, just a whole bunch of super smart people that read history and understood, what you needed to do to create a viable society based on the concept that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with inalienable rights of life, liberty, and freedom.
There are certain elements that I believe could be advantageous in arriving at a longstanding and sustainable strategy for American empire. What elements come to mind to you, Joe?
I mean, the elements of empire, if you will, the things we did in the late 1900s when we annexed Philippines and Puerto Rico and places like that. But for the most part, I would call it American leadership of the world. And because what we want is partners that of their own free will recognize that being part of our team or the team that we are leading benefits them, benefits us. It's a win-win situation. The leaders generally in every tribe is generally the strongest guy is the leader. And we are by far the strongest person. So the question is, do we have the wisdom to go with the strength to be able to improve the life of every member so that every member of our society is willing to fight together, to even die together for the cause. And that is our challenge, to be an inspirational leader and to recognize that if the Chinese partner is the one in charge, everyone's going to look at, and the Chinese are going to look at how do they benefit first and foremost, whereas we are the ones that are going to look, how do we as a group benefit the most? I think it's far more a question of our leadership and the type of world that we want to live in and the type of humanity that we want to have, as opposed to us controlling everything. No, it's people making the choice themselves to participate in that, just like you make the choice not to jaywalk, hopefully, because you know that can cause some sort of damage someplace else in the ecosystem, and you're not that selfish that you only care about yourself, but you care about the common good. So that's the way I would frame it, and again, to the point I raised earlier, only America has the history, the culture, the people that can accomplish that, and the value system. So it's up to us to organize it and move it forward.
I really like the approach that you have, because you're pushing for freedom and democracy, and you're pushing for ideals where people are enabled and not disabled. So to think about African strategy going forward and then connect that to our current challenges with China. We know that, right now the US is planning to be less interventionist in the world and have a less, defined role, whereas China's pushing to go forward in that direction. And so what would be best if we think about our strategy towards Africa over the next 30 to 50 years and our priorities? What could we offer and leave Africa in a manner that aligns with our strategy, but also make sure that Africa gets the right types of values and not the wrong types of values from different partnerships that may occur? Because it may be China today, but it may be a different adversary in the future that comes up that we don't necessarily see.
My view is that the way that we achieve what I call a century of freedom that we can enable is that we do that in partnership with allies, and we organize the world in such a way that to real deterrence, not proportional deterrence. There's no such thing as proportional deterrence. Deterrence is saying, I don't want you to do X. If you do X, the punishment for certain is going to be 10 times X that you're going to have to pay. And you know it as soon as, and it specifically deals with using violence to achieve your objectives, which is the default condition of humanity. There is the saying, a line in the sand. And how does that statement, come about? At some point in history, the Syrians, who like to invade their neighbors, etc., threatened Egypt. They were going to invade Egypt. And Egypt was the breadbasket of Rome. Rome depended on Egypt grain to feed all those people, made lots of money. It was a great colony for Rome. So Rome sent one of their senators on the white flag to talk to the leader of the Assyrians. And when he met him, he drew a line in the sand. He said, on that side of the line is Syria. On this side of the line is Rome. You cross this line, you are at war with Rome. And Rome has sent me here to let you know that if you cross that line, we will raise as many legions as we need, and you know that we have the ability and we have done it, as many legions as we need to come here and kill every single one of you. Not only that, we will, enslave, send all your children to be slaves someplace else, and then we will salt the earth. So history will have no reckoning that your civilization ever existed. And if you don't believe us, try to find a Carthaginian that will tell you otherwise. So you stay on your side, don't cross this line, and everything will be fine. And Syrians are still Syrians. Rome kept Egypt. Everything went fine. That's deterrence. That is deterrence. And if we treat the world with that sort of resolve, and every time someone has the audacity to challenge stability, security, and freedom, they will pay a price that is as certain as the night following the day. And you do that, you can establish and enforce the right behavior in the world so that people can actually enjoy the fruits of their labor.
Joe, you've spent a lifetime moving between strategy, industry, and national service, and you've seen America from the inside, from the battlefield, the boardroom, and from the perspective of someone who chose this country after growing up under communism. As we wrap up, I'd like to leave listeners with one final reflection. If there's one assumption that policymakers in the White House or the next generation of leaders need to challenge right now, whether it's about China, Africa, or America's long-term role in the world, what is it, and what would you urge them to do differently starting today?
I would say that they should look forward, not in the rearview mirror. I was at a conference recently, and there was some discussion about the NSS, they have new ideas, etc. And someone very senior said, well, that's not, these people don't know what they're doing. This is not the way we do things. The reason we even had the discussion is because the way we do things has created a mess. And we are in a huge mess, and we're looking forward to an even bigger mess. So just because we don't do things that way, so we really have to look very critically at how we have done things, and at a minimum, make sure that the way we're going to do things in the future are not a repetition of the way we've done things in the past, because the things that do not work do not need to be repeated. And unfortunately, it's far easier for patterns to be continued, etc. And we are at a tipping point right now, given a number of factors that's going on in our society, etc., that it's not the object of this discussion, but we are definitely at a tipping point. So the question is, where do we go from here? Do we use this, this tipping point to move forward or not forward? And my last observation on this is that in order to accomplish anything great in human history, it always comes on the back end of some crisis or calamity. We are definitely in a crisis or calamity point. It does not necessarily mean that we'll do something better, because after Rome fell, came 1,000 years plus of darkness. So, where people live shorter lives, weigh a lot less, had far less security, etc. So, just because we're in a crisis point doesn't mean that the future is going to be better. But at least we have the opportunity now to hopefully shape a better world. And that's what I would urge our leaders to think in the long term. What kind of legacy do they want to leave? How do they want to be remembered by themselves, by humanity, by God, and by future generations?
Joseph Schneider, thank you for joining the Global Signal. It's been a real privilege, and eager to see what manifests in real time based on the lovely discussion we've had today. Thank you.
Thank you for the great questions.
Thank you.